In this lecture, we finally make our way to speaking about Martin Luther, who, of course, is one of the great figures in church history. It's the custom of, say, Time magazine. Every year, they have a person of the year, right? And so they'll choose a specific person who's made a big impact on society, sometimes either for good or bad. And so they'll put that person usually on the cover of a magazine late in the year and say, this is the person of the year. Then they'll also do sometimes a person of the decade. And I think that when the century ended in the year 2000, they did a person of the century. I forget who it was. I think they might have said it was Einstein or somebody like that. But if you had to pick a person of the millennium, which single person has influenced the world more than any other single individual? I would argue that's Martin Luther. I really would. Because not only what he did was an incredible change in Christianity and in the religious world, but it was also had extremely powerful effects in government, in economics, in society as general. It's a hugely significant event, the Protestant Reformation. And, of course, Martin Luther's all at the center of that. But, of course, we remind ourselves, as the woodcut reminds us up on the screen, that it didn't happen in isolation, right? Luther received something from Huss, Huss received something from Wycliffe, and Luther passed it on to people beyond him. But it all started with Luther in his early life. Luther was born on November the 10th, 1483 in Eisleben, Germany. The day after his birth was the feast of St. Martin, so his parents, who were named Hans and Margareta, they named him Martin. Luther's father was a miner. He worked the copper mines of Mansfeld, where they had moved at some time after Luther's birth, and he came from peasant stock. He was successful enough to have started his own copper processing business, and he had a position among the leaders of the people of the small town of Mansfield by the year 1491. These are Luther's parents. You can see that they look sort of stern and dour, and it's true. That's how they were. I mean, they were raised in a very difficult age, and they do not seem to be parents who doted a lot of love upon their children, but were just sort of, parents, I should say, typical of that time. Luther's few recollections of his childhood that have survived reflect what you might call a somber religious life and a very strict discipline that was common for that age. His schooling seems to be somewhat remarkable. He went to the Latin school at Mansfeld, and then he spent a year at a school in Magdeburg, run, again, by the Brethren of the Common Life, which was this medieval lay group dedicated to Bible study and education. And then when he was 15 years old, he went to Eisenach, where he sort of went to the very next level in his education. Eisenach is a city where Luther came, and he ended up actually moving in with a fairly wealthy family and living in a house that's memorialized still to this day in Eisenach called the Luther House. The story goes that Luther and his schoolmates had very little money and they had very little food, and they used to go around sort of as beggars, more like street performing beggars. They would go through the streets and sing. They would go up to a door, sing songs for the people, and hope for some goodies from the people. Well, as the story goes, Luther came to the house of this one remarkable, somewhat noble family, and the woman, the mother of the family, was so taken with Luther, just the way that he looked, just with the excellence of his singing voice, that they really doted upon him, and she ended up bringing him into their home. I think in some ways this story is sort of oversold, because a lot of people want to use this whole account of the period that Luther spent with this more wealthy, cultured, and connected family as a way to explain his later impact on the world. You see, a lot of people have trouble believing that the son of a miner, the son of very common people, could really, change the world the way that Luther did. And they sort of had to connect him with some kind of wealth or status or influence. And so I think it's possible for people to overemphasize this particular account from Martin Luther's life. Anyway, when he was done at Eisenach, he began what his father wanted him to do. You see, Martin Luther's father wanted his son, who was very intelligent, to be a lawyer. And so at the age of 18, in the spring of 1501, Luther went away to the University of Erfurt. Now, Erfurt at that time was one of the oldest and most popular universities in Germany. And there he talked long enough and seriously enough to where he was nicknamed the philosopher. He learned how to play the lute, which was sort of a medieval guitar. He distinguished himself in study, eventually earning a Master of Arts degree in a day when very few people went that far in their scholarly studies. Now, it was at Erfurt, I believe when he was about 20 years old, when Luther saw his very first Bible. He was 20 years old before he had even seen a Bible. But as he saw it, he was deeply stirred. He read it, and one of the first things he read was the story of Hannah and Samuel, and especially the way that the Lord called to Samuel, and it had a very special impact on him. You see, like many parents of his time, Luther's father had great hopes for his son, and he wanted him to be a lawyer, so he paid his university expenses. He paid for the expensive textbooks, and then he was very, supportive of his son's education and wanted him to go on to the next step of law school. So in 1505, when Luther had just finished university and when he was 22 years old, several events spoke to him. First, a friend of his was killed in a fight, and he wondered, what if it had been me instead of my friend? Secondly, as he was traveling along one day, riding a horse, he had a dagger, attached to his belt, and the dagger accidentally cut into his leg, and it severed a fairly significant artery. Luther started bleeding like crazy. He cried out to the Virgin Mary for help, and he was able to survive that accident of the accidental cut in his leg. But the third event is held by most people to be the most critical. The third event, as Luther was riding his horse near the village of Schotterheim, a severe thunderstorm frightened his horse, and his horse threw him. He fell to the ground in terror because of the thunderstorm and because of the accident and being thrown from his horse, and he cried out to Saint Anne. Now, why Saint Anne? Saint Anne was the patron saint of miners and probably had a special place in the Luther home. And he vowed to Saint Anne, if you help me to live through this, if you'll save me, I vow to you that I'll become a monk and enter a monastery. So he became an Augustinian monk just at the time when he was poised to actually be one of the great young legal minds of Europe. His father was beside himself. He couldn't believe that his son was giving all his future away, all the money that the father had invested in the son's education and in the son's future. He couldn't believe that his son was throwing it all away to become a monk. But Luther, Martin Luther, was stubborn enough to do it, and he went into the monastery. Martin Luther, even though he was a monk, he still had a very sharp legal mind. And that legal mind helped him to appreciate his own sense of guilt before God. He would often speak with his mentor at the monastery, the leader of the Augustinian order in Erfurt, Johann von Staupitz. Now, sometimes Staupitz would get very frustrated as Luther would come to confession. Luther would come to confession and begin confessing every trivial sin. Because for Luther, there was no such thing as a small sin before a great God. So you can just picture this scene in your mind, right? It's confession time, and the monks are always supposed to go to confession, right? It's just part of the good Roman Catholic life, so a monk should do it. So Luther sits down in the confessional, and there's his confessor, this godly man of the monastery, Johann von Staupitz, and there he is before this man, and he's confessing his sin, and Luther starts going on and on with the littlest sins that 10,000 other people wouldn't think to confess. And you can just imagine what it's like for von Staupitz there in the confessional booth. He's just getting tired and going, Luther, it's reported that one time Staupitz became so frustrated with Luther in the confessional that he told him, go out and do some real sinning and then come back here. Well, Luther had a torment within his soul. You could say that it was his spiritual, I'm going to throw a German word on you, his spiritual Anfechtung. Now, Anfechtung is just sort of this dark terror or gloominess that comes over a person. And this spiritual Anfechtung was the result of three things. First, he had a good mind which could properly analyze things. Second, he knew that he was a sinner and that God was righteous. Third, he understood the idea of righteousness, or I should say the righteousness of God, through medieval theologians and not through the Bible. You see, the phrase, the righteousness of God, like most biblical terms, had been reinterpreted by scholastic theologians of the High and Late Middle Ages. Right? If you want to take the term grace and faith and justification, and then also the phrase, the righteousness of God, all of these terms were essentially redefined by the scholastic theologians. You see, essentially, they reinterpreted that phrase, the righteousness of God, to support a theology of law and works. For centuries, the church had taught that the righteousness of God was God's active personal righteousness by which he punishes or judges the unrighteous sinner. So if the righteousness of God is that quality within himself that bestows judgment upon you, right? Then how does it make you feel to hear that God is righteous if you're a sinner? You don't want to hear that, right? You shy away from it. The righteousness of God, that's what condemns me. You don't like to hear about the righteousness of God, even though you know it's true, because you know that you're a sinner. And this is what Luther tells us is what he learned. Therefore, whenever he came across the phrase, the righteousness of God in Scripture, he says he felt a little terror within his heart. He said, it struck my conscience like lightning, or like it was a thunderbolt in my heart, he says in another place. Because he knew that he was an unrighteous sinner who fell far short of God's righteous, God's perfect demands. Therefore, even in the monastery, Luther felt anger and hatred towards God. This is what he says. He said, I did not love. Yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinner. Luther felt, look, is it not enough that God crushes us miserable sinners with his law? Now he threatens us with punishment through the gospel of wells, because the Bible says that the gospel reveals the righteousness of God. And whenever Luther heard that phrase, he thought about it the way that medieval theologians did, and he said, the righteousness of God can only send me to hell. Now, in order to make himself right before God, he ended up following the general idea of the flagellants. And he went on a strict program of fastings and beatings and self-abasement. This is what Luther says about that period in his life. He says, I was a good monk, and I kept to the rule of my order so strictly that I may say that if ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, it was I. All the brothers in the monastery who knew me will bear me out. If I had kept on any longer, I would have killed myself with vigils, prayers, reading, and other work. He went on in another work to say, actually it's the same work, it's from the commentary on Galatians that he wrote. He says, I too may say that before I was enlightened by the gospel, I was zealous for the papistical laws and traditions of the fathers as any man was. I tried to live up to every law the best I could. I punished myself with fastings, watchings, prayings, and other exercises more than all those who today hate and persecute me. I was so much in earnest that I imposed on my body more than it could stand. Going on in his commentary on Galatians, this is what else he says. He says, I crucified Christ daily in my cloistered life, and I blasphemed God by my wrong faith. Outwardly, I kept myself chaste, poor, and obedient. I was giving to fasting, watching, praying, saying